It was late spring of 1947 when an elderly man, fragile in body yet unbowed in spirit, stood for the last time on a windswept ridge above the Pacific. His hair had silvered with a lifetime of storms and triumphs. His gait faltered, but his gaze held fast on the white towers that rose from the hillside like a dream made physical. He was William Randolph Hearst, a name that had once boomed from headline to headline, a voice that had shaped opinion and stirred the nation. For nearly 3 decades he had poured himself into that place atop the cliffs, a place he called La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. As the car doors clicked shut and the motorcade descended the serpentine road, Hearst looked up one more time at the fortress he had raised and left it to the wind. He would not return to know why a man who had everything would spend years creating an impossible castle in the clouds. Begin with the boy who first learned to imagine. William was born in the spring of 1863 in San Francisco, in a time when the American West was still being stitched together from grit and opportunity. His father, George, had not been born into privilege. He was a prospector who chased promise across deserts and mountain ranges, where many saw dust and disappointment. George found veins of silver and gold, wealth that transformed the family's fortunes faster than any polite society might expect. William's mother, Phoebe, came from another world entirely, cultivated, intellectually curious, and determined to expose her son to the grand sweep of human achievement. When William was 10, Phoebe led him on an extended pilgrimage through Europe that lasted more than a year. They moved from city to city, London's foggy streets, Paris's luminous boulevards, Rome's ancient stones. They wandered through palaces and cathedrals, from halls hung with tapestries to gardens laid out like poems. A child who had once traded marbles for coins now traced his fingers along frescoes and stained glass, learning that people could make the world into art. Those travels lodged in him like a quiet, insistent dream. One day, he would bring such grandeur back to his home. Back in California, young William developed an appetite for collecting. Where other boys hoarded shells or toy soldiers, he amassed prints, coins, rare books, curios, and curiosities. Every object felt like a lesson in culture, a tally of the world's riches. That accumulation would later fuel his vision. If the world contained marvels, he would gather them, rearrange them, and build a stage worthy of their splendor. He attended Harvard not as a studious monk but as a provocateur. Mischief marked him, pranks, audacious stunts, a flair for spectacle that would prove as useful as any formal education. He did not graduate with a scholar's measured honors, but he left with 2 things far more durable: a love for the dramatic and an instinct for what drew people's attention. The first major pivot came when his father, having speculated in more than mining, acquired a moribund San Francisco newspaper. George had little interest in journalism. He'd won the paper more for sport than purpose, and saw it as a curiosity. William, however, saw a stage. He took the helm of the Examiner and remade it into a machine for emotion. He learned the cadence of appetite, the way a headline could quicken a morning walk, the way a scandal could gather readers like prayers gather a congregation. He printed stories that felt immediate, raw, sensational, human. People read not just for facts but for feeling. Under his editorship, circulation ballooned. When his father died, the paper and a growing appetite for influence fell to William. New York beckoned. In 1895 he purchased the New York Journal and staked his claim in the nation's loudest marketplace. There he met Joseph Pulitzer across the colonnade of competing presses, and together they forged a new kind of journalism, flashy, theatrical, ruthless. The newspapers became dueling stages where headlines warred for attention, where stories were dressed in the bright garments of outrage and romance. This was the birth of the sensational press, the era of news as narrative and narrative as power. When the nation stood on the brink of conflict with Spain, the papers that he and his rival published did more than report. They inflamed, they framed, they nudged public sentiment. Whether his voice alone ushered a nation into war is an argument for historians. What is certain is that Hearst proved how a publisher could move a country simply by deciding how to tell it a story. By the turn of the century, he owned newspapers spanning the continent, magazines that landed on parlor tables, and a growing portfolio that made him one of the wealthiest men the country had ever seen. Yet despite the gold and influence, he kept reaching. Possessions for him were not ends but instruments, tools to gather beauty, to construct authority, to carve a name into stone and memory. Money would supply the means. Legacy would justify the expense. Then came Marion Davies. In 1916, in a theater in New York, Hearst watched a young chorus girl move with a vivacity that stopped him. Marion was not merely pretty though, she was that. She had an ease and warmth that made her presence a remedy. Where ostentation could alienate, she disarmed. William, then in his 50s and married, was smitten in a way that would alter his life's course. They formed an attachment that the public could not quite classify, not marriage in law, but marriage in life. Marion did not shy from the role thrust upon her. She embraced it as confidant, hostess, and creative spirit. Together they would shape a world that reflected both of their desires, his for architecture, hers for performance and friendship. When Phoebe Hearst died, she left her son more than memory. She bequeathed him an immense sum and hundreds of thousands of acres on the central California coast, a place where the sea met open sky and the land rolled away in hushes of grass. William remembered camping there as a boy, the smell of pine and salt in the air, nights spent beneath a cathedral of stars. At 56 he saw in that hillside the canvas for a dream, not merely to live within, but to stage the life he had always imagined. He wrote a modest note to an architect he trusted. "Build me a little something on the hill. I'm getting tired of sleeping in tents." That little something would consume nearly 30 years of his life. The architect he chose, Julia Morgan, was a revelation in a man's world. She was born in San Francisco and had pursued engineering and architecture when such paths were considered unlikely, even improper, for women. She taught herself to translate beauty into structure, to make art obey physics. After years of persistence, she was accepted into a prestigious Parisian school of architecture at first for a woman, returned home with a skill set that married the lyricism of European style with the sturdiness of modern construction. Her buildings, when tested by the great earthquake of 1906, stood while others fell. That proof won her clients and, more importantly, Hearst's respect. From the moment she set foot on the rugged San Simeon Ridge, she recognized the scale of the undertaking. There were no roads, no reliable water, no electricity. There were only cliffs and weather, and declined with limitless tastes. Yet where others might have balked, she embraced the challenge. Under her stewardship, the raw land began to take on the shape of an impossible fantasy. Switchback roads carved by teams of men, water piped from distant springs, temporary generators humming into life while proper lines were run. Engineers and artisans arrived from Europe and Mexico. Stone was hewn and tiles fired. Ceilings and fireplaces were trucked across oceans and continents. Over the next decades, Julia drew, redrew, and reconciled William's enlarging visions into structures that could stand. From the beginning, Hearst's desires were vast and specific. He wanted cathedral towers to pierce the sky, courtyards that would hold the light of Rome, tapestries from Flemish chateaux, and a theatre fit for private premieres. He imagined a place where old-world romance met new-world convenience, fireplaces lifted from Spanish palaces but wired for electric lighting, a marble-lined pool warmed for year-round swims, libraries lined with books he'd collected and frequently read. Julia Morgan, patient and unfolded those dreams into plans that would eventually fill thousands of sheets of paper blue that sometimes needed revision, mid-flights of inspiration. When Hearst awakened with a new idea at 3 in the morning, the project unfolded in pieces. Before the central mansion rose, 3 guest houses were finished, small palaces each oriented to catch different aspects of the land and the sea. Casa del Mar looked out toward the ocean. Casa del Monte faced the mountain. Casa del Sol welcomed the sun. Each was appointed with antiques and details imported from distant places. By 1922, William and Marion were living among the workers, entertaining, hosting, and building the rhythms of a new social kingdom. Guests arrived from Hollywood and Washington. From the stages of Broadway and the floors of Congress, the hilltop became a magnet for the notable, the ambitious seeking favor, the famous seeking leisure, the curious seeking spectacle. Casa Grande. The central house rose like an imagined cathedral. Reinforced concrete gave it permanence. Limestone, marble, and heavy timbers lent it the patina of age Hearst so adored. Twin bell towers climbed skyward. Inside were dozens own more than 100 rooms, libraries, galleries, a private theatre, billiard rooms, dining halls, and suites for guests. Tiles from Italian makers glinted beneath. Stout wooden doors bore carvings that had once graced monastic cloisters. Hearst filled these rooms not only with furnishings, but with an obsessive eye for provenance. Entire ceilings, carved stone fireplaces, tapestries and stained glass were purchased, shipped, and reassembled as if the castle were a collage of European memory. If any feature proclaimed the site's Hollywoodra glamour, it was the Neptune Poulan outdoor basin ringed with marble colonnades, Roman statuary, and glimmering terraces. The pool was heated and refined so finely that the line between swim and ceremony blurred. To lounge there was to pose beneath a Mediterranean myth. Inside the manor sat the Roman pool, a subterranean bathing hall cloaked in mosaic tiles and submerged lighting that made the water glow like submerged lapis. Statues and arches suggested an ancient temple. The tiled surfaces reflected light in 1,000 small constellations. These pools were not mere luxuries but stages, places where photographs were made and reputations polished. Hearst's private zoo added another note to the theatre. Animals shipped from faraway continents grazed in carefully tended pastures. Zebras might cross a drive. Giraffes bent to nibble oak leaves. Peacocks strolled with the indifference of small kings. To guests, the menagerie was exotic spectacle. To Hearst, it was another item in a collection that stretched from objects to living things. The road up the ridge became a procession of marvels, Hollywood lions and European tapestries, and, above all, an insistence that the world could be arranged to please. Entertainments at the Enchanted Hill were legendary. Visitors dined under banners and choir stalls that had once lined monastic refectories, sharing roast and hamburger with equal relish as orchestras played in the background and conversations stitched politics to gossip to art. Marian presided with a grace that softened the formalities of high society. She laughed easily, charmed the camera, and made rooms feel intended less for display and more for company. After dinner, the private theatre screened new films, sometimes weeks before the public release. Stars watched their own images flicker against the screen, applauded, and were looked upon by fellow talents who made the hillside feel like an alternate Hollywood, where fortunes were not only made, but celebrated. Yet, for all that glitter, the estate carried shadows. A life lived in public display breeds private strain. Marian, who had been adoring and unpretentious, carried a sorrow that no fate could erase. She longed for legitimacy, to be a wife in name as well as affection. But his marriage in New York would not end. The arrangement tolerated her presence, but forbade a final naming of their bond. Over the years the strain burrowed inward. Alcohol became both a balm and a danger, something their circle of friends noted with worry, something Hearst countered with paternal rule schedules for meals, limits at the bar, petty restrictions meant to protect rather than punish. Friends would smuggle bottles for her in spite of those rules, and the parties, while polite on the surface, carried the currents of private sorrow. The 1920s roared on. The castle rose, the parties thrummed, and Hearst's newspapers tightened their hold on public attention. But fortunes are not as solid as stone. When the Great Depression arrived, it gnawed at the empire. Newspapers faltered, investments soured, markets convulsed. Hearst's momentum so long a thing of direction and appetite ran into a fiscal reprieve. Yet even amid the economic tremors he continued to spend on things he believed would make his world complete. Sometimes his insistence read less like stubbornness and more like compulsion. A man who had built himself through spectacle, now refusing to scale back the staging of his life. Debt accumulated, hushed conversations in boardrooms turned into public scandals. Creditors circled. By the mid-1930s, the financial scaffolding that sheltered his enterprises began to sag. In 1937, the banks intervened. Trustees took operational control over much of the Hearst holdings. Hearst remained chairman in name, but the power of the purse, that quiet, ultimate power, was no longer his. He had to make choices none of his rivals would relish. The sound of hammers and saws on the hill ceased. Men who had spent years dusting imported carvings were sent home. The Enchanted Hill that had pulsed with revelry became an echoing place, its fountains growing mossy, its gardens leaning toward feral beauty. The unpaid bills shut down the great orchestrations of his life. If the depression had stripped him of comfort, a film would cut at something deeper: reputation. In 1941, Orson Welles released a film that would become a seismic work of art, a tale of a media titan whose accumulation of wealth, influence, and loneliness served to hollow him. The movie's fictional tycoon bore an unmistakable resemblance to Hearst the estate, the romances, the bluster. The film's name would be remembered by a different title, but the public recognized the portrait. Hearst reacted with fury. He used the remaining grasp of his media network to stifle the film's distribution, to press the movie's sponsors, and to direct scathing commentary at the playwright and director. For a time, he succeeded in smothering some of the film's air, but history has its own economy. Time would later hail the film as a masterpiece. The movie's success saw, perhaps, the attempt to quash it gnawed at Hearst. He had always believed a publisher's reach could bend public perception. Here, a piece of art told a counter-narrative that refused to bend. The portrayal of the woman in that story, a figure meant to echo Marion, hurt particularly. She had been painted in some retellings as shallow or foolish, when in truth she had been warm, larger than her press-clipped captions, and more complex than the caricature made room for. Marion, ever stoic, bore the blow with private pain and a public smile. When people asked if she regretted the life she had chosen, she answered in a voice that trembled but did not break. She would do it all again. That declaration was less a defiance than a recognition. Love and regret often live in the same house. After the storm of headlines and lawsuits and shuttered projects, Hearst retreated. He moved away from daily command and into a quieter existence. He maintained a hand in operations in editor's ink. Stain was still visible in letters he corrected, but his pace slowed. Health failed, as it will, and the grand parties that once drew presidents and actors dwindled. Marion stayed by his side, offering what she could: devotion, companionship, and intimacy rescued from scandal. The castle remained a presence he would not entirely abandon. He asked to receive photographs of its terraces, insisted on reportings of its conditions, and imagined himself walking its corridors when his body could not make the trip. In the summer of 1947, time finally took its natural course. William Randolph Hearst's heartbeat, a rhythm that had kept tempo with the nation's headlines, stilled. He died at the age of 80. The very papers that had once heaved his name across the front pages now carried the news of his passing in the same bold fonts he had once commanded. Obituaries were divided. Some lauded his innovations and boldness in shaping public conversation. Others criticized the ways in which he had used power to bend stories. Yet across the debate, one fact rose: he had altered the shape of American media and left behind a monument of stone and memory. At San Simeon, caretakers slowed their chores and lowered flags. The great house slipped into an autumnal hush. The rooms that had welcomed presidents and comedians sat waiting like actors after the final curtain call. The Neptune pool's marble glimmered in a quiet sun. The Roman pool beneath the house, once alive with the sound of conversation and echoing laughter, reflected ceilings for rooms no longer occupied. The private zoo's animals were given to public zoos and sanctuaries. Grass reclaimed the paths where zebras once roamed. The estate resumed the patient work of weathering, its stones keeping long memories. Marion's grief ran deep. She had been, by choice and devotion, more than a guest in the man's life. She had been his companion, his partner in the performance of living. Hearst had called her his dear Marion. She had loved him enough to give back in the way she could. When banks tightened their hold, she quietly sold jewelry and assets to help settle debts and pay costs. She refused offers of Hearst family money when pride or pain made the gesture necessary. She wanted her actions to speak for their relationship, and they spoke with an immediacy that money could not change. She kept a photograph of Hearst close by him, not as the tycoon in stiff suits, but as the softer man with a simple smile, a man more private than the public figure his empire required. When, over a decade later, the family chose to release the estate to the state, they transformed a private dream into a public treasure. The gift was an acknowledgement that some creations, though born of single obsessions, carry value beyond the vanity of their makers. The doors that once opened only to the invited now opened to the curious. People flocked to walk the same halls where film stars once laughed, or politicians once negotiated. They climbed the roads that had been once choked with limousines and tour buses, stood upon terraces and looked down where the land fell to the ocean, and felt, in the chandelier's glint and the worn stone, echoes of a life lived large. Julia Morgan's contribution, too long uncelebrated, later received its own recognition. She spent a lifetime making things that were both beautiful and enduring. Her work across the state schools, colleges, public buildings exemplified an approach that married grace to durability. Her ability to take Hearst's often profligate imagination and turn it into structural truth was her art. When, years after his death, people walked through the castle's rooms and felt the solidity beneath their feet, they were walking through a kind of quiet testament to her craft. Today the site stands as both museum and mirror, reflecting the contradictory nature of its origins. People come for marble and myth, for mosaics and gossip, for the carved doors and the stories of lavish parties beneath the stars. Guides point out stained glass windows, tapestries, and ceilings, salvaged from centuries-old palaces, objects that, in Hearst's hands, became part of a new narrative about what an American home could be. Tourists linger at railings to watch the Pacific unspool below, as Hearst once did. And in the wind, some feel a sensation like recognition. This was a man who wanted to bind the world's beauty into a single place. The castle keeps his name, not simply as an epitaph of wealth, but as a complicated lesson about the shape of ambition. There is a sadness threaded through the estate's stones, a sense of a life that stacked external grandeur atop internal fractures. In the galleries, portraits look back, and one has the impression of an architect and a patron arranging, with the same hands, the props and the stories of their own lives. In the quiet rooms, where tapestries breathe softly in the ocean air, a visitor can sense how even the most enduring creations are eventually inhabited by different purposes. What was a private court of influence becomes a place of learning and wonder for strangers. What was once an instrument of social currency becomes a museum of communal memory. Yet there is also a quieter, more tender legacy. Hearst's appetite for collecting preserved things that might otherwise have been lost. Ceilings that would have been destroyed by war or time. Tapestries that might have frayed away in an ancestor's living room. In assembling these artifacts, he created a kind of archive of human craft, a compendium of objects that today educate and astonish. Julia Morgan's buildings endure as practical artworks, proof that when imagination is tempered by skill, structures can survive tremors of the earth and the storms of time. Marian's presence survives in the stories that recall a woman who held the center of a complicated orbit with grace. The estate, in its turn, teaches that the urge to gather, to preserve and to stage life's grandeur can produce both beauty and ruin, comfort and isolation. It is a place of paradoxes, like the man who built it, standing upon a terrace now. A modern visitor can watch a gull lift from the rocks as the sea runs silver. Weathered stone warms in the sun, and the Neptune pool still reflects the sky. In such moments the castle reads as a type of elegy, an enormous, eloquent attempt to fix memory in marble. Hearst sought not just to live well, but to be remembered, and he succeeded in that in a manner most people do not. The castle endures not merely as a static show of wealth, but as a story of a boy who learned to dream in Europe, of a collector who turned his hunger into architecture, of an unlikely partnership that could not be named yet held steady for decades, and of an architect who bent structure to fantasy with patience and craft. The man himself is gone, his newspapers folded into the history of American media, his direct influence dissipated into time. What remains is more complex than triumph or failure. It is an artifact of ambition in all its forms. The estate is a reminder that human lives are constructed as much from the things we build as from the choices we make. It instructs us that beauty without balance can become brittle, but also that obsession can lead to creations no one else would have imagined. Marion Davies lived the rest of her life carrying the memory of that companionship close. She did not remarry. Her life, once a spotlight, softened into quiet acts. A photograph here, a donated painting there, small gestures that believed in love more than in reputation. Julia Morgan continued her work, a steady hand making spaces for others, long after the clamor of Hearst's parties faded into history, and the Castle Cuesta Encantada stood, weathering sun and fog, enduring as a public place where visitors come to peer into a world's past and into a man's appetite for wonder. If you walk the halls today, you will see that no single narrative can contain a life. Stones tell of grandeur and aspiration. The artifacts tell of taste and acquisition. The empty rooms tell of absence. People stand at the windows and look out over the ocean and feel, perhaps, what that boy had felt decades before in the echoing galleries of Europe, the visceral pleasure of a horizon that seems to promise permanence. But permanence is a shape the world rarely keeps. Instead, what lasts are the traces, the ceilings and the tiles, the stories of parties and the private photograph in a widow's hand. The Enchanted Hill holds them all, mixed as if in a cabinet of curiosities where each object is both trophy and testament. William Randolph Hearst's life was, in the end, an act of arrangement of people, objects, and narrative. He sought to lay claim to beauty by collecting it, and to secure his place in memory by building a temple to taste. The castle he built is imperfectly perfect, a beautiful rebuke to modesty, a gift to posterity, an admonition about the cost of insisting that a dream be absolute. On the last day he stood upon the ridge. Perhaps he saw not merely the stones but the whole of his life arranged like exhibits in a museum of the self. Perhaps he felt triumph, perhaps regret, perhaps a mingling of both. But as the car rolled down toward the world below, leaving the white towers behind, the hill remained a place made by longing and kept by time, where visitors still come to witness how one man's hunger to possess the beautiful became, in a way he never could have fully anticipated, something that belongs to everyone.